have made it back. Next up, mindfulness beyond white supremacy culture. Fredrick, take it.
Thank you so very much for having me here today. And I'm going to be talking about mindfulness beyond white supremacy culture. And basically, we're talking about a pathway from the Buddha. I'm going to talk about 3 examples and then some practice suggestions, and then we'll just see how discussion flows. I've got some discussion prompts if folks want them. And I just want to say thank you. So this conversation that I'm putting forward, it started at the last conference, right? Shemeka Thorpe and Natalie Malone were talking about knowing my body and what makes me feel good, about mindfulness, and we started a conversation then, and then it kind of continued through emails and Zooms with some other folks after that. And it inspired me to go down a rabbit hole, which I'll be talking about today. And so the last time I was talking about appropriation, and so now we're going to be talking about white supremacy, which very much relates to what Anthony was just talking about, the whole first, second, third order change stuff. So I'm in the Pacific Northwest. I live here because I have a deep loving connection with the volcanic mountain chain here, and then how those drop out into the oceans. I really love this place. I'm a sexuality educator and also a sex therapist in a town called Portland, Oregon. So I was wondering, could I sell someone some snake oil? Like, would you like some? Maybe? Anyone? Could I? Would anyone here like to buy some snake oil? It's really good snake oil. Like, it's awesome snake oil. It's only 50 cents. Like, for 50 cents, like, wouldn't you totally like some snake oil? All right, so the feeling you're having right now, this is at the core of the dilemma that we're having right now with mindfulness. Snake oil actually has value. True snake oil. So when I went through cancer, Subhuti Dhammarananda was kind enough to treat me. He is the only traditional Chinese medicine practitioner in North America who is allowed to make snake products for medicinal use. And that's because snake oil, which was actually the oily substance from snake's bile, venom, muscles, and skin, which has a lot of amazing 2,000 years of clinical data to prove that it can help high fevers, appetite suppressant. It even helps with some forms of cancer in very limited situations, cardiovascular disease. So white folks, Stanley Clark in particular, who got famous for it, took snakes, tossed them into a pot, boiled them, skimmed off the fat, and mixed that in with bourbon, cyanide, who knows what, sometimes killed people, but sold something that had no value whatsoever, and it took something that had a lot of value, that had thousands of years of tradition, and it made it into something that now is considered to have 0 value. So that no one in this room would even want to talk to me about buying some snake oil. Mindfulness has that potential trajectory. So last time, when I was talking about mindfulness, I was talking quite a bit about Thich Nhat Hanh and Goenka and John Kabat-Zinn and Laurie Brotto. Like if you're doing the research in sexual mindfulness or non-sexual mindfulness, these are some of the names that will come up on a pretty regular basis. I'm going to be talking about the work, and I'm going to be leaning in and doing some critiquing. I'm not speaking smack about them. I really, truly love and respect the work that they are all doing, living or dead. It is important. It has value. But there might be some limitations that we can look at so that mindfulness doesn't become a snake oil of the future. And so there's a lot of clinical data showing how mindfulness can relieve or completely ameliorate symptoms such as anxiety, automatic reacting, premature ejaculation, traumas. There's a massive amount of data showing how wonderful mindfulness is in the clinical setting. And so, really, truly, I'm a huge mindfulness fan. It's part of my personal lived daily life experience. It's also at the core of my PhD dissertation. I love mindfulness, but there needs to be more to it. And the core of the critique comes of John Kabat-Zinn. And it's very much what Anthony was just talking about, right? That John Kabat-Zinn, who has essentially created an international franchise called the Global Mindfulness Collective, or Collaborative, they're focusing on first order change, right? Non-judging, patience, beginner's mind, trust, non-striving, acceptance, letting go. These are all wonderful, important things. They are. Like, I'm not saying these are bad. However, it's not the end all, right? This is a part of the puzzle of true holistic health. And so there's this great philosopher, Anthony Penn, who just said something really brilliant. And I don't know if Anthony, if you want to kind of repeat what you just said, but something along the lines of like, whiteness is only promoting first order change because they don't want to see their relationships and their communities change. And so they're not putting forward anything but the first order change. And that's kind of at the core of the critique. I don't know, Anthony, if you want to say something, if not, no, okay, cool. But I am totally going to like hit you up for a quote because what you said was brilliant. But they're getting a lot of criticism of that sort. And so Rupert Gethin is one of those people that's doing a lot of the work around critiquing the current contemporary mindfulness. He's talking a lot about appropriation, and that there's a lot of stuff that's lost in translation. You know, the translation from true snake oil to appropriated snake oil. There's a lot that's lost in translation because they need to look at the holistic picture. Mindfulness is not the end all. It's a piece of a puzzle, and you need to understand it all, and you need to be able to guide your clients around all those pieces and not just this one first order change piece that it's focused upon. And Ron Purser is another one of the big critics of the contemporary mindfulness work. Really, he's to the point of almost being flat out violent to Kabat-Zinn, where he attacks him on a very regular basis, talking about the passive observer of human afflictions and how Kabat-Zinn is so privileged, and that's the reason he's doing it, and that he's basically selling a commoditized form of impotence, where he's basically just teaching people how to not help themselves and to stay subservient to the structure, to the industrial cultural structure that we have. So when you think about mindfulness, we often, people practice yoga, people have heard of yoga, and often people think of like, oh, right, those are like skinny people sitting on like yoga mats and I don't know, they stretch and stuff. Well, those are the asana, right? That's the thing over here circled in gray. Asana is one of those 8 sadhanas. Sadhanas means practice, right? And so practice means that everything you try over and over again, you try, you fail, you try, you fail. So even enlightenment, samadhi, enlightenment is a practice. It's not an end goal. You don't like become enlightened and poof, you're always enlightened. It's a continual practice. And you only get in the sort of the Judeo-Christian Anglo-Saxon sort of view of goal orientation, you only get this enlightenment if you do the other 7 pieces of the puzzle. So you need to be, working your body through the asanas. You need to be working your mind and your focus through meditation. You need to practice self-discipline. You need to focus your concentration, your breath, your senses. And the most important, the thing that is brought up in the critique all the time is virtue, the yama. Virtue, which is essentially becomes actionable as second and third order change, the virtue is the most important piece that is often left out of contemporary mindfulness practices and teaching. And so when the Buddha put forward the Eightfold Path, and I'm not trying to convert you to Buddhism, simply just looking at the roots of mindfulness and where that comes from, and that maybe there's some things lost in translation if you don't read it all and figure out all the parts and pieces, is this idea of mindfulness is one of those parts. There's also the efforts that do, the way that you live your life, the speech, what you say, the actions you take, the intentions, the way you go about those actions, the way you go about the speech, your views. That's positionality, right? As academics, we often will talk about positionality. That is part of the Eightfold Path. And then concentration, of course. And so enlightenment is actually right concentration. It's not some off-the-planet, existential, out-of-body thing. It's being able to be concentrated and focused in your body with a holistic understanding of the full Eightfold Path. And so another thing that can be really confusing, this whole idea of right mindfulness versus wrong mindfulness, or right concentration versus wrong. And so this right doesn't really translate into English. Right is more, if you think of a pathway. And so it's sort of a quote from the Buddha, because nothing was written down from the Buddha until 400 years after the Buddha passed. And then this is the first English translation of the Buddha's speech that was in Sanskrit, that was translated into Pali, that was translated into English. So who knows if there's anything at all to do with what the Buddha said. However, there are two extremes. One extreme is one that is totally focused on the passions, right? That is, whatever you feel, that you're at the whim and the mercy of the wind. You're going to do whatever you feel in any particular moment, whether it's something that's going to help you or harm you. And then the other side of that, the other extreme, is asceticism. And asceticism is typically that view that is connected with Judeo-Christian thoughts about being anti-sexual, about the body doesn't matter, it's about going off to heaven, and the body is this thing that we need to shed. And so the Buddha was saying that we need to be on the path between extremes. That rightness is a pathway, it is a journey, and it is ever changing. And so this brushstroke in the middle, that's maybe the center of this rightness. But on a Tuesday, the dotted line more to the left, this is actually the most right thing for you on a Tuesday. On a Thursday, this over here is actually the most right thing for you because you eat different foods, you slept differently, you had an argument with someone. Rightness changes every day for every person, and rightness is different from every person to the next. So what is right for me, I can't tell you do that, because it probably will not be right for you, and even if it is, it won't be right for you tomorrow. So to understand that there's a pathway, and then there's off the pathway, is potentially a easier way to comprehend it. And so a lot of this has to do with words and learning in time. And so Buddhism first started getting translated into English in 1845. The first translation of the Buddha's sutras, basically the Buddha hanging out under a fig tree and talking to people and sharing their thoughts, the suttas. Those were first translated in 1881. And you might have also heard of the Kama Sutra, which was also translated at the same about time in 1883. And the Kama Sutra, which, because of it being overtly sexual and sensual, that it was published and it was paid for in publishing by people that were British. However, it could only be sold through private channels because it was considered so horrible and so taboo that society would burn it if it came out in the public. And so understanding the culture of the time, the culture of the people financing the translations, the culture of the people who are paying for the publication, that can help you understand the way in which the first translations, which are still the ones that are used to the day, and that fill even people from South Asia that are rediscovering their own Buddhism, are often rediscovering it through these translations, these English translations, that they have this asceticism deeply ingrained in them. There is sensuality in these, so it's not entirely void, but the commentary is often highly aesthetic. But Rhys Davis also, even though a missionary and an ascetic, he was also someone that lived in India, that spoke with people for decades, and so he's generally respected as having an understanding of the nuance of language, even though he had a religious and aesthetic biasing to his work. So when I think of this pathway and learning over time, it's tricky because one of the things that the Buddha struggled with is that they were trying to explain existentialism before there was anything along the lines of existentialism. They were trying to explain enlightenment without language that had words for enlightenment. And so they were struggling with the vocabulary of their time. And so that was actually part of why, beyond just the resource aspect of having things to write upon, that it was very purposeful for it to be an oral tradition for 400 years. It was more important for people to talk about the ideas, to go back and forth, to get things right, to get things wrong, to tease out an understanding and meaning from a human perspective rather than quoting the Buddha directly. Because the Buddha was stuck using words that didn't even describe what they were trying to describe. And so Lopez kind of follows up on this idea as talking about how important it was for that tradition of the oral tradition to be able to create fidelity in the understanding of meaning. That they got to be both right and wrong. They got to have conversations about it. And through that, the words are not sacred. They're not golden calves to be prayed to. The words are a form of ventriloquism. Speaking today. Ventriloquism. An ability to be able to sort of speak to the nature of enlightenment, to be able to speak to the nature of what the Buddha was saying as if we're using our voice to speak for that former person. And there's this other piece from Toni Morrison, which I really love, and trying to understand how you can come from this idea of white supremacy, this idea of words being perfect, to an understanding of pathways. Is Toni Morrison has a piece about the river, and that the river changes over time, but the river changing over time is changing because it has perfect memory of where it should be. We as human beings, at our core soul, we know how we should be. We know the path that we should be upon. It's society that built the dams, that built the walls, that basically forced the Mississippi River to be where it didn't want to be, where it shouldn't be. Society often changes our innate state to be harmful, to be hiding. And so to come back to that perfect memory of the pathway. So the first example I have is, the three examples all are inspired from the book Beyond White Mindfulness. And so the first one basically is focusing upon the Bodhi tree. So the Bodhi tree, that's the name of the fig tree that the Buddha was hanging out under when they reached enlightenment in their mid-30s. And it's where they hung out and talked to people about what this enlightenment thing was. And in this chapter, they're specifically talking about a Bodhi tree that is on one of the islands of Hawaii. And so the interesting thing for me is that in this chapter, they talked about Asian Americans reaching a connection to themselves in Hawaii by going and putting their hands upon this Bodhi tree and feeling a connection to the oneness of that Bodhi tree. However, they don't seem to understand how that Bodhi tree actually created massive harm. And so back in 1887, King, I'm having trouble with pronunciation today, King Kalakaua was king of Hawaii, and he went on a trip to San Francisco, and he was basically imprisoned, stuck in a hotel room for the rest of his life. The U.S. government would not allow him to return to Hawaii. His sister, who was not queen at the time, was basically made queen regent because the king was no longer in Hawaii and couldn't come back. The queen did not want to be queen, even though the U.S. government asked her to be queen, because she knew that for her to be queen, the king would have to be killed, and that was her brother, and she didn't want her brother killed. So some writings call her the queen, others do not, because she never accepted the title of queen, because that meant the death of her brother. Enter her best friend, who also was of royal blood, Mary Foster. And Mary and Little Connie were very, very angry and upset with what was going on. They're very sad about what was going on, and they couldn't figure out how to process what they were feeling in their own personal hearts, and they were taking action to try to overthrow the U.S. government taking over Hawaii. Well, Angelica Dharmapala was trapped traveling back home from a lecture in Chicago, and his flight happened to stop over in Hawaii. And the British thought it'd be a really great idea for Mary Foster to meet Dharmapala. So they did. Dharmapala was trying to finance some of the colonialism that was going on in India. So Edwin Arnold and Alexander Cunningham were two people from the British Army who, after retiring from the Army, were given different titles in northern India to be able to help foster and sustain the colonization, the British colonization of India. And Dharmapala, he went to a temple which was held and maintained by a number of monks. However, they were Muslim, and Dharmapala did not like this temple being held by the Muslims, and the British were trying to push out the Muslims, and so they teamed up. And they teamed up because of a society, which I'll go to in a slide or two. But Alexander Cunningham did this really fascinating thing. He planted a tree. He got a clipping, possibly from a tree down in Sri Lanka, from the monastery where Dharmapala lived. He planted it at what is now called the Mahabodhi Temple, which is where the Bodhi tree lives, which is where people go to. That tree was planted in 1891. Buddha sat under the actual Bodhi tree 500 years before the Common Era. That tree died. Relatively nearby, but it's not the same tree whatsoever. That tree was planted by a British former army officer to be able to create reason and justification for pushing out the Muslims to take over what's now called the Mahabodhi Temple, and to help enforce the British rule over northern India and the potential risk of China pushing back over the Himalayas. So it's very important to fortify this northern edge of India. Foster, who was very much involved, I'm going to flip back to that. So Foster, who was very much involved with trying to liberate Hawaii and trying to liberate the Queen from U.S. forces, was putting a lot of her time and money and efforts into that liberation. Dharmapala convinced her instead to start financing to the order of millions and millions of dollars then, which are even more now, to finance the Mahabodhi Temple and then the construction of the other temple at Vihara. Just imagine instead, as a mindfulness teacher, instead of focusing on first order change and being like, it's okay for you to be upset, it's okay for you to not be happy about these things, you can't change that. Instead of doing that, what if Dharmapala actually was like, you should focus on that third order change. You could actually do the revolution that you've been working on. Instead of financing the building of my temple and British colonization, instead, perhaps, you could actually keep the U.S. out of Hawaii. However, we know how history went. It is possible that if that hadn't happened, if the revolution had continued, it is possible that the U.S. would basically had an entire genocide of the entire Hawaiian people, which is quite possible. It was very common for the U.S. government to do that at that point in time against any resistance. So it might have saved the Hawaiian people, but we don't really know. So Dharmapala, I'm leaning into them. Mind you, they are considered a bodhisattva. They are essentially considered a saint in India. So they did many wonderful things as well. But did they help Hawaii? As a mindfulness teacher, did they help Mary Foster? Did they help Queen Lilakana? And did they help Hawaii? I don't think so. And so when the students are going and putting their hands on the tree at the Foster Botanical Garden to connect with the Buddha, what are they actually connecting to? Potentially, I believe they're actually connecting to white supremacy. They're not connecting to oneness. And so the interesting thing was that Dharmapala, who was against the Muslims, actually was one of the founders of the Theophilosophical Society, it started primarily in the United States. It bridged around the world, and it was basically trying to go beyond religion to some kind of higher truth. But apparently it was only a higher truth that agreed with their politics. Eventually it fell apart. The US and the European branches kind of splintered, and then the European branch is actually what informed Himmler and the SS and Nazi Germany. So it started off with the best of intentions, but it went a whole bunch of wrong. And you'll see it referenced in Hollywood loves it all the time. Example 2. So this, I think, is a more positive way of helping people who are in Hawaii. And so these teachers, to help their Hawaiian students and to understand mindfulness, are connecting with pronunciations today. Mu'oko'oha, I destroyed that, and aloha spirit. I can't even say those words. So Mala'oloko Ohana is essentially anything that is upon the land has connection. So right now, since you're visiting Colombia, your feet are upon the land. You have a connection to Colombia. You are part of the spirit of Colombia at this moment. If you leave or you harm Colombia, not so much. But as long as you are in line with the spirit of the place, you are part of that family. You are part of that place. And so it's part of the beauty and the joy of Hawaii, but also part of the destruction. It's part of what welcomed the U.S. occupation, because once people were on the island of Hawaii, they were they were essentially Hawaiian. They were part of the people. They were part of the land. They were part of that ecosystem. As long as they're not harming. So, and they also talked about aloha spirit, which is recognizing a way to be able to bring indigenous sensibilities, a true cultural sense of place into the laws and the structural systems. Aloha spirit in 1986 was made part of Hawaii law. Whether it's followed by politicians or not, there's definitely a lot of critique around that. However, it is part of Hawaii law that all people, all politicians, that they are supposed to be agreeable with pleasantness. They're supposed to have humility with modesty. That they should have patience with perseverance, kindness with tenderness, and unity with harmony. And that these are the guiding principles for the entire state of Hawaii. And so putting these into law, to me, shows a lot of potential. It shows that a third order change as being central to the mindfulness tradition and the teaching of mindfulness. Third example, it's coming out of the same group of research that Shemeka and Nicole were talking about at the last conference. And so this was the work that Candace Harkins did with Black Lives Matter meditation. And so I think the starting point for that is we've already been talking about whiteness and how you define whiteness and what is this whiteness thing, the they that we've been talking about in the chat thread. And so Hooks talks about whiteness as being an ever-present sense of terror, that it is everywhere, it is in our blood, our bones, that it affects everything. And Hooks also talks about the traditions, the mindfulness traditions, that the literature on Buddhism has been exclusive. It allows a lot of people to say that it has nothing to do with me. Many people see the contemplative traditions, specifically those from Asia, as being a privileged white thing. And interestingly, there are a lot of people in contemporary Southeast Asian society who similarly think that these traditions that Americans always say are the Southeast Asian traditions that they don't feel connection to because of centuries and millennia of politics and suppression of these philosophies. And so a lot of people around the world are relearning Southeast traditions through that American lens. So Hooks, was quite a scholar on Buddhism, practicer, and also has amazing critiques of the way in which Buddhism is carried out. Then white supremacy culture, which, so that of course is where the title of the lecture comes from. And is looking at the way in which mindfulness is taught and the way in which people exist in U.S. society. That almost all of these are still central to that first order sense of mindfulness. That they are not necessarily considering that any of these things should change. That this is the status quo and it should just keep on going. And Hargens has two different meditations that were released out on the internet. The first one was released in 2017. And I would love to talk to Candice about these at some point in time. Unfortunately, I haven't got any return emails or anything. But the first one, I would say, is that first order change. It's working on capacity building. It's working on people living in a place of terror to build capacity, to be able to have that first order change, to feel good about themselves, to be able to feel happiness, wellness, peace, safety, love, which is so amazingly important. This is why in the mindfulness tradition, even though I'm critiquing it and saying there could be more, it's still important, it's still amazing, because that first order change, that is important too. And if we think of things sequentially, the first order, second order, third order, then maybe we do need to do the first order change first. If you don't have the capacity to be able to wake up in the morning, if you don't have the capacity to walk out your door, if you don't have the capacity to go to work, to do the things you need to do on a daily basis, then you definitely don't have the capacity to change the world, to do third order change. So capacity building is so very important. And I feel that's kind of what Hargens was focusing on with the first one. A year later, they released a second meditation, which is for the allies and accomplices meditation. And this one is about taking action. It is about that third order change, that things cannot stay as they are, that part of mindfulness is creating change, that we need to change the world for ourselves, we need to change the world for our brothers and sisters, we need to change the world because it is not okay. And I think it's so wonderful that the Hargens was able to create these two different forms of mindfulness meditations, so that even though in some of it she does target the accomplices as being for people that are white, that I see them as being linked. That the first meditation is about capacity building, that first order change, and the second one is potentially about the second and third order change and taking action. To build capacity first, and then work on that taking action, the second meditation. So I like to link them personally. So some of the practices I might put forward. One of the other chapters in the book talks about W. Du Bois' work around double consciousness, that one can feel joy and oppression concurrently, that living that life of terror does not mean that you are always in terror, that you can feel joy. There can still be rainbows and sprinkles and cupcakes, even though you're living in oppression. And to be able to understand that, Ken Wilber has something similar. It's a little bit more on the existential philosophical side, but it's a similar idea of double consciousness that he talks about witnessing, which is very different from spectatoring. Witnessing is this idea of being able to look upon those two concurrent realities, to be able to look upon the world you want to have, to be able to look upon the world that you're living in, and to figure out how to bridge it by being compassionate to yourself in the present moment, that you need to build capacity here and now to be able to push into the inertia to create the change that you want in the future, which is hopefully tomorrow, but could be next week, could be next month. And so some of those stresses, some of those traumas, there's a whole range of them, of course. This is just a starting list, but it's ones that I often will use with students and with clients to talk to them about. Having a sort of a checklist helps people to be like, oh, yes, I'm feeling tension, but why are you feeling tension? I'm feeling tension about my bodily or cognitive ability in relation to what society tells me I'm supposed to be doing. Or I'm feeling tension because of physical abuse that I have had in the past, or that has been very recent. That I am feeling tension because of vicarious trauma, because of the seniority of others that is held over me. And so this is a whole series of different things that potentially, if you want, you're totally welcome to screenshot. That these are a number of different things that potentially are the root or cause of tensions that people are feeling that mindfulness can be really helpful around. The other thing I really like to bring forward is paranoia, right? That when we're feeling the trauma, when we're feeling those oppressions, is to not get sucked into that. That is not, it can't cover everything. At the same time, we need the double consciousness. We need to understand the pronoia, that there are things in the world as if they're magically going right for us. There are things that are wonderful. And if we get stuck in the pessimism, if we get stuck in the oppression, without balancing it with that pronoia, which is something that Zaleka has talked about in the past at conferences, and I think maybe I think we talked a little bit about it at the last conference as well, that we need a balance of the negative and the positive. And then with every single person, I'm using food as a metaphor here, but we each need individual balance, right? Not everyone needs the same foods. Not everyone needs the same quantity of each types of those foods. So just like you're going to balance your diet, you need to balance your mindfulness. You need to balance your yoga practice. You need to balance the amount of hours that you're on the mat with the number of hours that you're meditating, with the number of hours you're taking action. All these things need to be balanced, and they need to change day to day, person to person. And then the Eightfold Path. So mindfulness is a lovely starting place, but remember all those other aspects of the Eightfold Path. And then yoga, that the asanas are very popular, hanging out on the yoga mat, doing stretching on the yoga mat is great, but really to focus on the virtue, right? How to live first, second, and third order change, how to bring that into your livelihood is possibly the most important of the yogic practices. These are 3 books that I really recommend beyond White Mindfulness and McMindfulness. They definitely sort of push in and critique the contemporary mindfulness practices that come in primarily from Kāmā Aikya. If you really want to geek out, you can get into the Buddha's Discourses, and then a lot of citations. These are the main ones that were at the core of what I'm talking about today, but of course there are a whole bunch because I love to read stuff. So thank you. And some discussion prompts if folks want them. How might you as a practitioner mindfully guide a client's treatment plan? How might you support clients' capacity building? How can you live with both oppression and joy concurrently? How might you stop perpetuating harm? And how might you be an agent for positive change? So that's what I got. I saw some smiles while I was talking. Hopefully that's for good stuff and not gas.